Welcome to our seminar, everyone. My name is Philip Gailtsov, and I'm working by Östgruppen, the Swedish Initiative for Democracy and Human Rights. Today we're going to listen to our colleagues who agreed to share their experience of their work on the rule of law and anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine. Now I leave the floor to my colleague Tobias Lundvall. Please, Tobias.
Thank you, Philip. As Philip said, my name is Tobias Ljungvall. I also work for Östgruppen. I'll be moderating this seminar. We have an hour at our disposal. I think we will use the first half hour for interventions from our distinguished panel, and the second half hour for questions that you can pose either by raising your hand digitally or writing them in the chat. So our panel consists of Tatiana Shevchuk. She's the coordinator of international cooperation at the Ukrainian Anti-Corruption Center. We also have Lars Thomson. He's a member of the Swedish Parliament for the Center Party. He's also a member of its delegation to the OSCE, and he has been involved in projects to establish rule of law, to strengthen rule of law in Ukraine. And he also has experiences of land reform and other areas that are relevant to this topic. He will share those experiences with us. And thirdly, we have Christina Parandi, who is a political officer at the Swedish Embassy in Kiev. She will tell us about Sweden's role in strengthening rule of law in Ukraine. And finally, we have Maria Nilsson, who is a member of the Swedish Parliament also from the Liberal Party. And we will start with Tatiana Shevchuk from the Ukrainian Anti-Corruption Center. Please, Tatiana, tell us about the work of your organization and the result of the anti-corruption reforms and how this is viewed by the civil society in Ukraine today.
Hello, Tobias. Hello, dear distinguished guests. My name is Tatiana Shevchuk. I represent Anti-Corruption Action Center. We are a non-government organization in Ukraine. Our main goal is tackling grand political corruption. Thus, we are working on advocacy of anti-corruption reforms, judicial reforms, and law enforcement reforms. Also, we do a lot of work on analyzing public procurements, different civil servant appointment, etc. My talk today would be dedicated to the recent, or rather say ongoing, anti-corruption reform. In last 7 years, it's already 7 years as Ukraine started this transformation from the revolution of dignity. It was the first moment when Ukraine actually did anti-corruption reforms, but not promising them. So back in 2014, the idea was that we have like really corrupt governmental system, but the main problem, of course, was the absence of working anti-corruption preventive norms, but most importantly, the whole system of protection of government as law enforcement, judiciary in the sector of anti-corruption didn't work properly. Thus, there was idea to create separate bodies that would be new ones that would not be influenced by any external or internal interest, and they will work on this punishing and investigating corruption. Thus, we created so-called anti-corruption infrastructure. It consists of Agency on Prevention Corruption, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, which is a law enforcement authority that investigates corruption, the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecution, and later we understood that without Special Anti-Corruption Court, there would not be like an end result of this system. It may sound like so many bodies responsible for anti-corruption, but in Ukrainian context, it was the only way it could work. And I would rather say that we had a very tremendous results in these 7 years. In the section of prevention, we created a completely new system of corruption prevention, which is foremost known by the new system of asset declarations, which is very progressive. In Ukraine, it's like electronic asset declarations, which are all public and transparent for general society to see and to look into. And they also became, at the moment, seen in the political life, because when we first start to discuss any politician, any appointment to public service, we discuss their declaration of this person and thus discussing their integrity. Then the Anti-Corruption Bureau, which started the work, it showed that there are no untouchables in the country. It started to investigate really complicated crimes. It started to investigate high-level politicians. It started to investigate MPs, because previously, with high-level political impunity, both legal and both in political culture, the MPs were untouchables, and there was no real prosecution of them for corruption. Now the Bureau started to investigate them, showing to the general society that there are no untouchables, and the special unit of prosecution and special court, they do help them to deliver such like results to the society. Unfortunately, of course, the work, firstly, I would say about the great support Ukraine had from our partners, both in both European countries and the international institutions. All this transformation, and without them, it would not be possible. They helped channel this will of Ukrainian people, the demand of Ukrainian people for change, for fighting against corruption. They this international partners, Sweden, of course, helped us to push our political elite, our government, to really do the changes. Of course, there is no perfect reform. There is a big backfire of corrupt elites, of oligarchs against these anti-corruption reforms. We witnessed a lot of attempts to block the reform through corrupt courts, through other bodies, through implementing of the unfavorable laws in the parliament, and even the decisions of constitutional court. So at this moment, we are focused on protecting the achievements of the reform and the next stage of anti-corruption reform. It's a bit wider. It's about course, because without fair judiciary, we cannot achieve real integrity of public officials and justice for all. So the corrupt courts and their inefficiency is the problem. And now the scene number one in Ukraine is the judiciary reform. It's also connected to this promise or idea of President Zelensky to fight oligarchs, because oligarchs actually use their corrupt courts in their interest and get the necessary decisions, which actually violate the human rights, which violate legitimate interest of good-minded business, and so on. So this is like the next stage of transformation of Ukraine to work on judicial reform. On this, I would rather stop and give the floor to my other colleagues, but I will be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Tatiana. I'm sure there will be questions about that. Please, Lars Thomson from the Centre Party, Member of Parliament in Sweden.
Thank you for the time here. I consider Ukraine as my second home country because my grandfather on the mother's side came from Gammelsvenskby, is called Smevka in Kherson region. So I've been there several times. And I also worked as a project coordinator for ICLD and SIDA with projects in Ukraine. That's why I will talk a little bit about them. Our project were in the way to improve institutional capacity, try to build a local democracy.
I'm sure we have all heard about SIDA, the Swedish International Development Agency, but what is ICLD?
International Center for Local Democracy. It's a founded by SIDA, and it's actually has its center on Gotland, Visby, a small part with SQR money and SIDA money. So I would say these projects have been very successful. We worked with them 4 years. In overall, I think it's time to see that Ukraine has been free for 30 years now, from 91 to up to today. And I must say I'm very disappointed on the democracy development overall. And the main cause to that's the corruption. So I really think this seminar is on the right track. I try to give you 4 small examples how corruption is working in the normal life, just to get you an idea what is about. For my village there, Smievka, at one time at the one election, he said, "Oh, now I have to change party." And I asked why. Yeah, because the new president has a different party on the national level. If I don't change party, I won't get that much money. And he wasn't willing to do that, so he had to quit instead. That's a sign of corruption. You have to have the same party as you have above to down. Another way we have worked with a lot of, not much money, but some money in these projects. And the main question you get all the time is, what amount do you want at the receipt? The first time I didn't understand it. Of course, you put the right amount what we're built for, but that's not the way it works. They could fix the countings with special amounts, whatever you want actually. And that leads into the third point. Everything is in the system is built up to cut in between. You take money in between what is official or what it should go to. I have several projects in this village. They are building projects. We have put in a lot of money for helping the elderly care for the center, for example. And suddenly you could see the manager for the elder care center, their home were built instead of this elder center. And we had this city council chief or the board by himself. They got money for changing the street lights or putting in new street lights, and those street lights ended on his own backyard. Of course, he wasn't re-elected after 3-4 years, but he didn't care. He got good lighting at his backyard. So that's the way it is. And I would say it's very, very into the culture after the Soviet period. So it's really hard to stop, and it's on many, many different levels. I would make 2 comments about 2 different reforms that I think is really important for Ukraine's future and this issue. That's the decentralistic reform or commune reform, municipality reform. If I take that example in Smievka, it's called decentralistic reform because you put tax levels on 2, both on national and local level, actually exactly the same system as Sweden has inspired to and has been really successful in Sweden, even though some parties have forgot it now. But so that's why it's called decentralization. But in the real time, in real for average person, it's quite more like a centralization, because these 24 small villages, they lost all their local power. They lost their Soviet, the city board. So instead, they got into one bigger municipality. So my point with this decentralization, I really understand it has to be that way. We have done it the same in Sweden, 1952 and 1971 and so on. But you really have to do it in the right pace for the development in the country. And you really have to have the good for the people in the focus, not the good for the reforms, the good for the theoretical reforms. For example, here it's very obvious that the roads are in very, very poor condition in Ukraine, and they have bad public transportations. That means you have to have a much more spread out service than you could have in other countries. And my second comment on another main reform, that's the land reform. Every land so far has been government owned in the way it is now. And I really know that it's extremely necessary to have a land reform in every country to get development. And the thing is that you have to own your own land. That means you could borrow money and use the land as a security and then invest on your companies. But you really have to do it in the right way, and they should really learn how we have done it in Sweden and other countries, that you should sell to those people who lives and works in the villages and countryside. For me, it's they have put in a new reform, decided about that, and the main issue here, main question is if you should allow abroad companies to own land. That, for me, that would be extremely bad development in the country, because then you sell out the national reserve from the whole Ukraine. Actually, consider that the land is so valuable and it's compatible on the world market, and the buyers will be two parts. If you open up for that, that will be oligarchs, or that will be China. So I really have to emphasize that you should do this reform, same as the other reform. You have to do it with a focus on the good for the citizens and normal people inside Ukraine, and that is those two reforms are very much into how the corruption system is working as well. I stop there.
Thank you, Lars. Kristina Parandi from the Swedish Embassy in Kiev, please, political officer.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. So as Tobias mentioned, I worked in the political section department on a wide range of political issues. And today I would like to focus on three main themes in my presentation. Basically, why the rule of law reforms in Ukraine are important for Sweden, how we assess the progress that Ukraine has already achieved, and also what we as Sweden are doing to come forward with even better results. So as you know, for Sweden, Ukraine is undoubtedly one of the most important partners in the Eastern Europe. And since our embassy was established in 1992, there has been just a wonderful cooperation between the two states. And currently, Sweden is also one of the key reform cooperation partners in Ukraine, with the support programs ranging from decentralization, as the previous speaker has mentioned, to public finance management reform, to human rights promotion, gender equality, and many others. And since we have been following Ukrainian both political developments and the reform developments very closely, we came to realize that no area can achieve any progress without the rule of law reforms, which are fundamental. So we see the rule of law reforms as being built on three pillars, and this is why Sweden takes national interest in actually helping Ukraine to advance them. First and foremost, the rule of law reforms are demanded by the Ukrainian citizens. Especially after the Revolution of Dignity, the public demand for justice was one of the strongest sentiment in the Ukrainian society, and Sweden, which of course promotes democratic development, is very much respectful of that wish of Ukrainian people. Secondly, we also realize that this is in our national interest to help Ukraine with the rule of law reforms, because as we have seen on multiple occasions in the past, that ineffective rule of law system in Ukraine destabilizes the internal situation and actually helps some external forces like Russia to achieve its own ends in Ukrainian domestic political landscape. And this is why if we want Ukraine to be stable, resilient, and democratic, we need to support those reforms. And thirdly, we can't distinguish between having the good investment climate in Ukraine and having a functioning rule of law system. So we know even from the companies, the Swedish businesses whom we support as one of our core tasks at the embassy, that for them, the indicator of how Ukraine is scoring on anti-corruption and on the judicial reform is one of the fundamental checks which they conduct before they decide either to enter Ukrainian market or to stay in this market. So this is why we just believe that it's impossible to achieve any progress without having solid results in this area. Now, when we talk about our assessment on the Ukrainian track record in this field, of course, we see a mixed picture. We have lots of very positive, I would say even groundbreaking results, but we also see some shortcomings which still need to be addressed. And that's something that we are trying to support as well. As Tatiana has mentioned in more details about all the new anti-corruption bodies which were established in recent years, we believe that this is one of the signs of this really positive developments, which are actually incredible if we compare the pace with which these reforms were conducted. But also, apart from this anti-corruption infrastructure, Ukraine has came up with really innovative solutions in terms of anti-corruption mechanisms, which includes the very famous electronic procurement system ProZorro, or the electronic system for verification of declarations of public officials. So this is something which is not only the achievement of Ukraine, but also something which can be used as best practices for many more countries in the world. And that's really astonishing. And finally, we also see that now the Ukraine security sector is being reformed, and that concerns the anti-corruption dimension of its activities. We hope that very soon Ukraine will adopt the legislation in the second reading, which would allow to transfer economic investigation from the security service to another body. And we believe that would also minimize risks for corruption and abuses in this area. And what is important here, that Sweden is very proud to have supported this exact reform through our support to the European Union Advisory Mission. So that's something we have been following also quite closely. Now, if we have a look at another dimension of the rule of law sector, we are a bit less optimistic about the judicial reform. Again, I think Tatiana mentioned it in the beginning that Ukraine has been experiencing some issues with this area, and the attempts we have seen before to finally proceed with such well-needed reforms have stalled in the past. However, we are remaining optimistic in the aftermath of the constitutional crisis which Ukraine experienced late last year, when the Constitutional Court attempted to undermine Ukraine's anti-corruption system. We believe that this crisis actually provoked the new possibility, the new window of opportunity to finally proceed with the reform, which now is considered by both civil society and international stakeholders as the top priority. And we are very positive. We have been welcoming the statements from Ukrainian leadership that it's really the time is right to proceed with this. And here, the Swedish position is that we very much share the consensus which exists among various international partners in Ukraine, which includes the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, European Union, but also G7 states, which together with the civil society have come up with a so-called roadmap on how to proceed with these reforms. So we believe this is a right way to go. And one more dimension which I wanted to mention in this regard is that the help of the Venice Commission, which provides legal advices and legal guidelines, is also invaluable. So we are very much supportive of what these international bodies are doing to help Ukraine to find its own template, how to finally bring about the lasting challenge. One more thing which is quite important in the Ukrainian context, that most of the reforms, I'm talking not only about the rule of law area, but also many others, they came about as a result of close coordination between Ukrainian vibrant civil society and to the international partners. So it is important that these areas stay in the focus and that there is a dialogue between international partners and not only state institutions, but also non-state organizations. Now moving to the final part of my presentation about what Sweden is actually doing. to support these positive changes. We have a variety of dimensions of our engagement, and first and foremost, we support the civil society initiatives who serve as watchdogs of the developments which are happening in the rule of law areas. We have quite recently launched even new projects which contribute to efficient public asset management and civic oversight. Just this month, the new contract was signed to support the aforementioned ProZorro system for managing of state property and to increase transparency in this domain. But also we provide institutional support to NGOs which are active in this area and which not only provide their kind of recommendations, but also they are helping to draft the new policy solutions. This comes both to NGOs and also to think tanks, which are quite important actors in the reform area in Ukraine. Secondly, we also support various international initiatives. I already mentioned the EU advisory mission for the broader law enforcement reform, because we believe that you can't just reform one area, you need to proceed simultaneously on the very broad scale on ambition, so that there is not just the patchwork of various support programs, but that's a coherent picture which actually helps to bring about synergies. And finally, our approach is based on treating these issues as the part of the good governance and broader transparency agenda. Again, to assess every opportunity from the perspective of the bigger picture and to help initiatives which can boost transparency in all fields of public domain in Ukraine. So that's briefly it from the Swedish side. And so as we usually say in our communications with the Ukrainian partners, Ukraine's interests in terms of security and stability and democracy is also within Swedish national interest as well. So that's why we continue to remain engaged, and that's why we are very happy that many other international stakeholders are also working with Ukraine on these issues.
Thank you, Christina, from the Swedish Embassy. Maria Nilsson, Swedish Parliament, Liberal Party.
Thank you, Tobias, and thank you to the rest of the panel. It was very nice and interesting, above all, to hear from you. I will speak a little bit. First, I want to say something that when I started studying Russian 20 years ago, no, not 20, but almost, in Lund, one of the first, not one of the first, but among the first words or sentences that we studied was this phrase, "pablatam." And you know, I assume, in this discussion what it means, "pablatam." It means, it's incredibly difficult to translate, but it sort of means that you give a favor in return for a favor. And this is also was part of sort of a black economy during the Soviet era. And why am I mentioning this? Because it's something that's still sort of part of the system, I believe, and it's sort of a bit of a reason for the corruption on a very personal level in post-Soviet countries. Nowadays, you don't hear the phrase very often, at least I don't do, but somehow it's still there. And one of the things with corruption is that it's, as Lars very well mentioned, is that it starts sort of the bottom and it goes to the top and the other way around. So it's sort of the intermediate system of corruption, and it's also, of course, unfortunately present in Ukraine today. I mean, you have discussed in terms of the Swedish commitment to Ukraine, and as a politician, I can only say that I believe it's a very strong commitment to Ukraine and to Ukraine's sovereignty, and it goes beyond party lines. I also want to stress the importance on the EU level. I know that the head of states in the EU will have a strategic discussion on Russia coming week, and the EU based its principle on on relationship with Russia on 5 principles. And one of those principles are pursuing closer relations with Russia's post-Soviet neighbors. And I believe that's the key here, that Sweden as well as the EU should perceive closer relations with Ukraine, and supporting the anti-corruption reforms and the rule of law reforms are fundamental in that relationship, in order, I believe, for the Ukraine to become more and more prepared to form a closer commitment to the EU, and hopefully sometime in the future even becoming a member of the EU. So I believe that's the Swedish part is very important, but I believe that the EU level is perhaps even more important, that the EU maintain a commitment to Ukrainian development and Ukrainian cooperation, focusing on hopefully a future membership. And in order for that, one of the fundamental areas to work with is corruption, rule of law, etc., and what you've been hearing here. I cannot say that the same commitment to this in the EU is perhaps as broad as in the Swedish parliament, but it's my assumption that it is at least a majority. Unfortunately, we don't work with majorities in the EU, but it is at least a very large group of countries who are committed to this, and hopefully more will join. Another part of this is, of course, that we as Sweden, being committed to Ukraine and to working with combating corruption, also need to continuously criticizing when we see there is a sign of corruption in Ukraine, and to sort of that, in order for us to bring Ukraine closer to EU, we cannot overlook instances of corruption, but need to maintain a critical eye on that. Yes, I will stop there and hand it back to you, Tobias.
Thank you, Maria. As we said, we take questions from the audience in the chat room, or you can raise your hands digitally. Can't see any question in the chat right now, so I'm going to post one myself. I think it was Christina maybe who mentioned the conflict between the Supreme Court, or the Constitutional Court, I think, late last year, and President Zelensky. They overran the anti-corruption legislation, making it inefficient, ineffective, canceling it, as I understand. So and Zelensky then tried to disband this court. Was it the Supreme Court or the Constitutional Court? So, constitutional, I think. So on the surface, as I understood it, we have a conflict here between constitutionality, because the Constitutional Court obviously has a constitutional standing, and anti-corruption work, which is equally important. Has that been resolved somehow, or what's happening? Anyone who feels, maybe Christina would answer that, because you mentioned it, I think.
Sure, I may start, and then if Tatiana, who follows these developments, will have something to add, then let's proceed like that. So basically, one first thing which we need to recall is that, of course, there were lots of legislative problems which resulted from this Constitutional Court decision, but most of them have been resolved by the parliament and the president, with the legislation being restored. So at least now we don't have this threat to the anti-corruption architecture as it was after the Constitutional Court ruling. Secondly, actually, the actions of, sorry for tautology, of the Constitutional Court is what I meant under this national security challenge to Ukraine, because we have some serious grounds to believe that the judges of the Constitutional Court were doing this on purpose. And obviously, there was a conflict between the progress that Ukraine has made in the anti-corruption domain and actually the aspirations of Ukraine to proceed with this Euro integration agenda. And on the other hand, we had this devastating decision which provoked a huge scandal, not only in Ukraine, but also outside. Now, the President Zelensky mentioned that it is very important that we do something with the Constitutional Court. And initially, he was registering lots of initiatives to disbundle it, to dismiss the judges. Not all of these initiatives, the initial initiatives, not all of them were constitutional from the legal perspective. That is why now the strategy is actually to proceed with the reform of the Constitutional Court itself, so that in the future it doesn't have this unlimited power to adopt decisions which may be devastating for other sectors of Ukrainian policy and politics. And so far, we have this draft law on the reform of the Constitutional Court, which awaits the consideration of the Parliament. It already had received the positive feedback from the Venice Commission with the caveat that actually we need to reform the process, how we select these Constitutional Court judges, because once they are selected, it's impossible to just easily dismiss them. So a separate line of work is going on that front. But as you rightly mentioned, Tobias, there is still a conflict which exists between some of the current judges and the president and the anti-corruption bodies.
Okay, thank you, Christina. I think that was clarifying. Tatiana, do you wish to add something, or should I proceed to the next question?
I think Christina covered that. I'm just adding that unfortunately, President Zelensky had a good start in resolving the crisis. He took leadership, and however, instead of resetting court under this rule of law procedures, and as we as civil society demanded to have the new procedure of selecting judges, he went against the personalities, against the not so good, not very diligent, and probably having Russian influences ahead of the court. But it's not the right way to avoid the crisis in future. But we hope that we will get back to this like wider public discussion, maybe in autumn, on the other stage of judicial reform.
Yeah, so like Lars liked to say in his intervention, it's about doing these things the right way. We have a raised hand from Kerstin Lundgren. Please, Kerstin, ask your question.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having this seminar. Interesting to listen to you all. And I fully agree with the position put forward that Sweden is very much in favor of cooperation with Ukraine, and also for the EU membership perspective.
And do I remember correctly that you are actually the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Swedish Parliament?
No, I'm not the chairman.
No, sorry.
I'm a spokesperson, although in the Foreign Affairs Committee for the Centre Party, and member of it. I'm a deputy speaker, but that's another thing. Actually, the question I would like to raise is more about this petty corruption, because Lars mentioned, and that was part of it, on the local level, the small things that is ongoing. Have you seen any attempts of implementing these new laws? Because usually when looking into many former Soviet countries, new laws could be voted, but in practice, the implementation, nothing happens. And that is, of course, the tricky part of it, get it passed through the legislation system. Have you seen anything moving forward in that sense? Thank you.
So you're asking Lars, or maybe all the other participants as well?
I would like to see more from Tatiana or Christina, or from the Ukrainian side. Lars mentioned his examples, but that was, I mean, it's ongoing. Although there are laws in practice should tackle that kind of system. But have you seen any signs of a change due to the new laws?
Tatiana, would you feel comfortable answering?
Kerstin, you're totally right. The implementation part is equally important as the legislative part. And in many instances, it's even more harder to have it done properly. For instance, in anti-corruption reform, this is very big part of our work, that we had these laws adopted 7 years ago, and we are pushing, we are monitoring, we are demanding the government for proper implementation. And because civil society as a whole and international partners were doing that, we managed to achieve the results. For instance, with other reforms like police reform, prosecutors reform, which are in the close sector, we don't have these results because the government failed the implementation reform, although the laws are really good. So I just sum it up that implementation is important, and this is something that should be followed.
Thank you. I think we'll get on with the written question. We have a long question here. I'm going to read it loud, and we'll see who answers it, if anyone. Thanks for very interesting presentations. I have a question on or if how the decentralization reforms have affected citizens' position vis-a-vis Kiev and or local elites. I understand large to mean that it has limited local administration's accountability to citizens rather than the other way around. But have reforms, including the merger of municipalities, led to increased and more equal access to public services and limited local elite capture? So, well, basically, how is the local municipality reforms affecting people's relations to those in power, I guess, or the elites? Lars, would you like to say more about this, or
I give a short comment because I don't have the overall picture, so I really don't have the overview. But it's quite a big risk that it goes the other way around to start. But in the long run, of course, this is with having two taxation levels, and that prevents cutting in between with the tax money from above to down. That's really a good thing to do, and we have every Western country have done this municipality reform. So in the long run, it's a good way for decreasing the corruption, but you have to do it in the right pace, and you have to do it with the right reforms, so you adjust it to the conditions on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take a short question from the chat as well. What's with Medvedchuk? As some of us may know, Medvedchuk has been declared well, things are happening to him. What is happening to him? This is a pro-Russian oligarch, and he's Putin is the godfather of his daughter, and he's always been a close ally of Russia, but still he is a top politician and an oligarch in Ukraine. And
a member of Ukrainian parliament, actually. So Tobias put it rightly that Medvedchuk has extremely, he portrays himself and is kind of a proxy man in negotiations, in uncovered negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. At least he used to be, and he is like direct Russian agent in Ukraine. He happened to be the member of parliament since 2019, and he beneficially owned pro-Russian propagandist channels, TV channels in Ukraine, which disseminate extreme propaganda. And in February, President Zelensky launched a standoff with Medvedchuk. Firstly, he sanctioned his channels. Then he sanctioned close allies and the wife of Medvedchuk because they were technical owners of his assets in Ukraine. And I think a week ago, the General Prosecutor's Office issued charges against Medvedchuk for treason. And as far as I remember, they're like violation of rules of war or something like this. So this is a lot of political thing, because it's the way Zelensky is trying to achieve several goals. Firstly, not to be liked by Ukrainian, like extremely pro-Ukrainian electorate, then to have more influence on the Eastern electorate, by cutting off this very pro-Russian influence there. And of course, he's trying to portray it in general as his war against oligarchs, because it's something he declared, that he is fighting oligarchs in Ukraine. And like #1 oligarch for him is Medvedchuk. We don't think so, that he's #1, because Medvedchuk actually doesn't have deep economic involvement in Ukraine. He has, of course, a lot of assets, but most of his wealth is coming from Russia. And he's just having something that is given by Russia, the export of diesel, gas, something like this. Once it's cut, his influence on the economy is not very big. It's the same as politics. But we have other oligarchs who are more deep-rooted in the system and have bigger political influence. And unfortunately, we don't see direct steps to confront them.
So the problem with Medvedchuk is not his oligarchy, but his pro-Russian role. That's at least why probably Zelensky is tackling him.
Yeah, it's one of the problems that he is receiving funding in Russia. He's himself funding their separatist like militia on their occupied territories. That's his problem, because he is like Russian agent here.
That's what he's being accused of, at least.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens with that. So we have a raised hand from Olof, and even though it's a small picture, it looks like Olof Kleberg.
Okay, well, Olof Kleberg, I'm a journalist. I've been former vice chairman of the Swedish OSCE network, and we have engaged in Ukraine questions for many years. Well, you have presented quite a lot of good aims. My question is, where is the power, the real power? You have mentioned there are a lot of oligarchs. There are some judges in the Constitutional Court working against the reforms. My question regards the government. Is the government united? Is it efficient? Is it strong enough against the parliament? And talking about oligarchs, President Zelensky is also connected with an oligarch. Has he a credibility in fighting against the oligarchs? Please, some comments from the Ukrainian side.
Well, the Ukrainian side, that would mean Tatiana. Please, Tatiana.
Quite a paradox, actually, because I'm talking about the strengths of the government, because we have a unique situation that we have the president, he has the majority in the parliament, his party had the majority of the votes, and thus he formed the cabinet of ministers. And it's good seen as a unity and the strong political power, but actually it's not uniform, and it's the presidential faction in the parliament is very fractioned, and there are different groups of interests that I would rather estimate that the government at the moment is weak because there is no inner unity, and there is no big trust between the parliament and the cabinet of ministers. And as the parliament sees the cabinet as representatives of president mostly, and the groups of interest. And in this situation, there is this is a situation when the oligarchs actually who have money and other like groups of interest, they just like buying their parliamentary votes, they buying the position in the government, they making a lot difficult to conduct normal politics when we can have like rather frank discussion, or at least you know who represents whom. And we have a situation when we don't actually know or just presume that somebody is representing somebody's covered interests. And so instead of having strong government of one president, we have the weak government of many oligarchs and many groups of interest. And Zelensky actually could be given that he has a majority and he had unprecedented support 2 years ago, he could actually fight oligarchs because he had a lot of power 2 years ago, but instead he decided to have a truce with them. He actually it changes their oligarchs' media influence and giving them favor, just exchanging favors. He gives favors to oligarchs, they give favors to him instead. His move to fight oligarchs sounds really good, but it's a populistic one as long as he doesn't confront oligarchs in the economy sector, in the media sector. I think it presented today or yesterday the new draft law, which will fight the influence of oligarchs in the media, because most of the media are oligarch controlled. And it has a tremendous influence on the politics. But I'm not sure whether it will be really a productive move or just some populistic thing.
Sorry, if I may, I have something to add in this regard from my political analysis of the situation. First, a very concrete question that you addressed is that Zelensky is connected to one of the oligarchs. This is actually not what we see as being true. Because if you mean Kolomoisky, after the 2 years of his cadency as the president, it seems that he is not connected to him personally. They had some business relations before, but I think that now we don't have any grounds to believe that he's serving Kolomoisky's interests. And what we have seen actually is that Zelensky is much more ready to go against Kolomoisky and against some other oligarchs than we've seen before. I also had a bit of clarification from my side about this kind of balance of power between president, parliament, and the government. Actually, when we analyze the voting in the parliament, we see that when it comes to one of the electoral promises of the president, he still leads the parliament, and all these groups, even if they are affected by oligarchs or somebody else, they still unite. So I think that we have very clear leadership of the president when it comes to his electoral policies and the key initiatives. And the government, yes, it's weak, but it's weak for the reason that Zelensky did not appoint strong personalities. So what we have is actually the government, which is dominated by the president. So the government helps the president a lot to proceed with very, detailed, functional work. But we in the government, we also see the leadership of the president. So I think still we need to acknowledge that despite there are some influences, and we have seen them during a couple of important votes, that there were not enough votes from the president's faction. But I think that this is for the first time in Ukraine's history that we have the president with such an influence on all branches of power except for judiciary. So the executive, the government, and the parliament are still very much in line with the president's policy. And actually it has some good signs, because if Zelensky is serious about reforms, it means that both the government and the parliament can help him to implement them.
Thank you, Christina. I was going to ask you to comment. So we see no raised hands, no questions, and we have 2 minutes left until 1 o'clock. Well, there is a question actually, what we could do to help Ukraine. Is there anything we could do to help as a private citizen, he thinks, but well, Lars?
Yes, thank you. I think the major thing to do right now, that is to keep up the pace, and I'm very optimistic about this anti-corruption work that has been put in place after 2013. And from my point of view, it really has to happen on the top level, because it has to be some changes, really changes, so you could build trust for the normal citizens on the bottom level. So it really has to keep on the top level and doing everything that you have described now in real, and so people could see it's happening. Then you could try to restore this democracy for real. Thank you.
Thank you. We're 1 minute past 1 o'clock. So I thank all the participants of this panel. Tatiana, Lars, Christina, and Maria. And I also thank the people asking questions and all the other ones listening to this seminar or webinar. Hope to see you soon again.